Lucky was a young man full of promise, with a heart full of dreams and aspirations. The kind of dreams that seemed almost too big for someone who came from such humble beginnings. He had grown up in a small, run-down neighborhood, where the crumbling walls of the houses told stories of hardship, yet, in Lucky's mind, the world was his to conquer. His parents, hardworking yet struggling to make ends meet, often had their heads buried in bills and work. His father, a mechanic with shaky hands from years of labor, and his mother, a gentle woman who worked tirelessly at a local market, both dreamed of providing Lucky with the education they never had. They wanted him to go to a university, to see the world beyond the dusty roads and narrow streets of their neighborhood. But despite their efforts, money was always tight, and the dream of sending Lucky to a higher institution felt like a distant star that they could only ever gaze at but never quite touch. Lucky, though, wasn't the type to be easily discouraged. He was a visionary. He spent most of his days with his head in books, even when the flickering light from the single bulb in their living room wasn't enough to truly illuminate his path. He could imagine a life where he didn't have to struggle, where his family didn't have to worry about the next meal or the next bill. He dreamt of being successful, of one day having enough to lift his parents from their troubles. But reality was harsh, and after finishing his secondary school education, the world outside seemed like a never-ending maze, filled with obstacles. It was during this challenging period that Lucky found himself on the streets more often, trying to find ways to make extra money. He was still young, unsure of how to make his dreams come true, and that was when he met the boys from his street. They were the type of boys who seemed to always be laughing, always hanging out together, as if life was one big game to them. They were a group of friends who didn't seem to worry about their future, who lived in the moment, carefree and reckless. At first, Lucky thought they were just like him, young, full of life, and trying to figure things out. He didn't know that this would be the start of a journey he would come to regret. The boys, older than him, noticed his naivety, and they quickly took him under their wing. They welcomed him into their circle, inviting him to hang out with them after school, when the sun dipped low and the streets began to take on a different, more dangerous energy. They introduced him to things he had never imagined, things that seemed exciting and fun at first, but slowly crept under his skin, changing him from the inside out. It started with small things, things that seemed harmless at the time. They introduced him to the pleasures of smoking, a habit he had always thought was for the weak and the foolish. But in their company, it felt like it was just another way to be part of the group, to belong to something bigger than himself. Then came the gambling, which started off as a simple game of cards but soon spiraled into long nights of risking whatever little money they had, hoping for a win that would never come. Lucky, who had always dreamed of a better life, began to lose sight of what truly mattered. The dreams that once shone brightly in his eyes were now clouded by the haze of smoke and the fleeting high of gambling. The boys didn't stop there. They slowly began to pull Lucky deeper into their world, introducing him to petty thefts, small-time stealing that at first didn't seem like a big deal. A wallet here, a phone there. At first, Lucky felt guilty, but the more he did it, the less he cared. The rush of getting away with something, of feeling like he was part of something secret, was intoxicating. And before long, he was no longer the innocent boy with big dreams, he had transformed into something else entirely. One night, as they sat in a dark corner of the street, passing around a bottle of cheap alcohol, the boys shared stories of a secret society, one that promised power, respect, and protection. They spoke of the supreme Eiye Confraternity, a brotherhood that ruled the streets with an iron fist. They painted a picture of a world where no one dared cross them, where their word was law. The idea of being part of something so powerful, so influential, appealed to Lucky's growing desire for status. He had never felt so insignificant, so invisible, and the thought of joining such an exclusive group seemed like the perfect way to change that. It wasn't long before Lucky was initiated into the confraternity. The ceremony was nothing like he had imagined. It was dark, secretive, and full of strange rituals that made him feel uneasy, but there was no turning back. They made him swear an oath, a pledge of loyalty, binding him to them forever. And just like that, Lucky was no longer just a young man with big dreams, he was part of something dangerous, something dark. The brotherhood took him in, and he quickly rose through the ranks, learning the ropes of street power, gaining influence, and feeling invincible. But with every step, the cost of his involvement grew heavier. His parents, who had always been so hopeful for him, noticed the change in him. They saw the late nights, the new friends, and the distant look in his eyes. But Lucky didn't care anymore. He had finally found a way to belong, to feel like he mattered, even if it was in the wrong way. The dreams he once had for a better life seemed so far away now, like a distant memory. In the world he had entered, there was no place for dreams, only power, control, and survival. But as Lucky's life grew darker, so did the consequences of his choices. What he didn't know was that the path he had chosen would lead him to a place he could never escape, a place where the cost of belonging was higher than he could ever have imagined. And as the days turned into months and the months into years, Lucky would find himself at a crossroads, faced with a choice that would determine whether he would ever reclaim the dreams he had lost. The question was no longer about whether he could go to school or change his life, it was about whether he could survive the dangerous world he had willingly stepped into. Lucky's life as a member of the Supreme Eiye Confraternity began to morph into something he could never have imagined. At first, the power, respect, and sense of brotherhood seemed like the answers to the emptiness he had felt for so long. The boys who had welcomed him into their circle now saw him as one of their own, and Lucky, eager for belonging, was quickly swept up in the lifestyle they led. But as days turned into weeks, and weeks into months, the weight of his choices began to settle deep in his soul. The promises of power and protection were no longer as shiny and alluring as they once were. At first, it was small things. Late-night meetings in dark corners, quiet discussions about territory and respect. They would talk about the streets, the rules, the lines that shouldn't be crossed, and how to ensure they were never crossed. Lucky listened closely, learning quickly, and for the first time, he felt like he had a purpose. But as the days wore on, he started getting involved in tasks that went beyond simply being a part of the crew. Slowly, his innocence began to slip away, replaced by a hardened shell that concealed the person he once was. It started with simple errands, picking up messages, collecting debts from local vendors, or making sure no one dared disrespect the group. These were things Lucky could handle. They didn't feel like they were crossing any moral lines. But that quickly escalated. One night, he was called to a meeting with the other members, where they spoke in hushed tones about a rival confraternity. There was talk of territory disputes, of respect, and of ensuring that no one threatened their control. Lucky didn't realize it at first, but the men around him were already planning something darker, a hit on the rival group, a way of sending a message to anyone who might challenge their dominance. He was hesitant at first, his heart pounding in his chest as he listened to the discussion. He had never imagined he would find himself involved in something like this. He had never imagined himself as a person who could hurt another, let alone take someone's life. But the more the men spoke, the more he felt the pressure of his new reality. This was what the Eiye Confraternity demanded: loyalty, action, results. And in that moment, Lucky realized that turning back was no longer an option. That night, Lucky participated in his first violent act. It wasn't something he had imagined would happen, nor something he could have ever prepared for. The rival members, who had been walking through the dimly lit streets, had no idea what was coming. The group, with Lucky now included, surrounded them. Lucky's hands shook as he stood on the sidelines, unsure of what to do, yet too terrified to leave. The scene unfolded quickly. There were shouts, violence, and the overwhelming feeling of fear in the air. Lucky didn't fully understand what had happened in the chaos, but by the end of it, one of the rival members was lying unconscious, and Lucky's heart was filled with a strange mixture of guilt and adrenaline. The worst part, though, wasn't the violence itself. It was the fact that Lucky didn't know how to feel. There was no joy, no sense of triumph in the aftermath. He didn't feel like a hero or a warrior. He didn't feel powerful. Instead, he felt empty. A hollow ache filled his chest as he walked back home that night, his mind racing with questions. How had he gotten here? Was this really what he wanted? Lucky had finally managed to break free from the dark grip of the Supreme Eiye Confraternity. After years of living in the shadows, buried under the weight of choices he wished he could undo, he received an opportunity that seemed like a lifeline. He had been accepted into a university in O'Hara, a bustling city in Delta State that promised him a fresh start, a chance to rebuild his life and pursue the education he had once dreamt of. It was everything he had hoped for. He packed his bags, said a quiet goodbye to his parents, who, though worried, were hopeful for his future, and set out for O'Hara. For the first time in years, Lucky felt the freedom that he had longed for. The streets of O'Hara were different. The hustle and bustle were unfamiliar, and yet, there was something about the place that felt like a new beginning. He moved into a modest hostel on campus and focused solely on his studies. He buried himself in his textbooks, determined to leave the past behind and build a future that had always seemed out of reach. He made new friends, kind-hearted individuals who had no idea about his past, and he felt like he was finally shedding the old skin of the person he had become. But, as much as Lucky tried to distance himself from the past, it had a way of finding him. It didn't take long for the word to spread. The Eiye Confraternity, ever watchful and always keeping tabs on their own, began making inquiries about him. They had heard whispers about Lucky's new location and his absence from the streets. The members of the Eiye group knew that something didn't add up. They couldn't allow one of their own to simply walk away, especially someone who had once been so loyal to their cause. They knew that if they didn't act fast, they could lose Lucky forever. And so, they began tracking him, gathering information and piecing together the puzzle. They learned that Lucky had moved to O'Hara, far from the territories they controlled, and had started living a different life, one that seemed to have nothing to do with the dangerous world they inhabited. To the Eiye, this was an act of defection, a betrayal of the brotherhood they had once sworn allegiance to. They weren't going to let him get away with it. Meanwhile, Lucky, convinced that he had successfully escaped his past, made new connections in O'Hara. The city, with its vibrant social scene and youthful energy, offered plenty of opportunities to meet people. And that was when he met members of the Maphites Confraternity. At first, they seemed like just another group of young men who were always around, always talking about the same things: power, respect, and loyalty. Lucky, still carrying the burden of his past but trying to carve out a new identity, found himself drawn to them. They didn't know about his history with the Eiye, and for a while, Lucky believed he could start fresh. The allure of the Maphite group was tempting. They promised a sense of belonging and protection, much like the Eiye had once done. They spoke of unity, of standing together, and of not letting anyone push them around. Lucky, although hesitant at first, found himself caught in their web of influence. It was a different group, but the feeling of power and respect was the same, and he couldn't help but be tempted by the idea of fitting in once again. Before he knew it, Lucky had joined the Maphites Confraternity, despite the fact that he was still technically a member of the Eiye. He convinced himself that no one would ever find out about his past, that the Eiye were far away, and that he could leave his old life behind. The streets of O'Hara felt like a world away from the place where he had once been part of something dangerous. He was starting anew, or so he thought. But Lucky's illusion of safety didn't last long. The Eiye had their eyes on him. They were relentless, and they would stop at nothing to track him down. They knew the Maphite Confraternity was powerful, but they couldn't allow someone who had once been one of their own to simply switch allegiances without facing the consequences. They had already begun to question why Lucky had left and why he had joined the Maphites. The rumors they gathered were clear: Lucky was no longer with them, and that could not go unpunished. One night, as Lucky walked back to his hostel, feeling more secure than he had in months, the familiar feeling of dread washed over him. It was an unsettling sensation, the kind of feeling that made the hairs on the back of his neck stand on end. He couldn't explain it, but he knew something wasn't right. His heart began to race as he looked around, but it was too late. The Eiye had found him. In the darkness of a quiet street, they cornered him. They were a group of men, all wearing the same intimidating expressions, the same cold, calculating look that Lucky had seen too many times before. They surrounded him, their presence overwhelming, and for a moment, Lucky was paralyzed by fear. He knew what this meant. He knew what they were capable of. There was no way out. Lucky panicked. He had no choice but to give them an explanation. His words fumbled, but the panic was clear in his voice. He claimed that he had been forced to join the Maphites Confraternity. He said that they had made him do it, that he didn't want to betray the Air Lords, but the truth was that he had made the choice. He had made the choice to escape, to find a place where he could start over. He didn't realize how wrong that choice would be. The Air Lords weren't fooled. They saw right through him. They didn't care about excuses, about the fear in his eyes or the panic in his voice. To them, Lucky had committed an unforgivable act. He had betrayed them, turned his back on the Brotherhood, and switched loyalties without a second thought. That was a betrayal that could not be forgiven. Without hesitation, they took action. In a flash, it was over. Lucky's life, once filled with promise and hope, was snuffed out in an instant. The Brotherhood, bound by their own twisted code of loyalty and vengeance, had claimed their prize. Lucky's fate had been sealed the moment he made the decision to walk away. In the aftermath, the Maphite Confraternity, unaware of what had truly transpired, continued to go about their business, ignorant of the cost of Lucky's actions. And the Air Lords, as always, moved on to their next target, leaving behind a trail of destruction and lives torn apart by the choices of young men who thought they could escape. Lucky's story serves as a stark reminder of the dangers of courtism, the false promises, the pressure to belong, and the consequences that come with trying to escape a world built on violence and loyalty at any cost. Let us say no to courtism. Let us choose education, peace, and the pursuit of dreams instead of violence, fear, and betrayal. The price of belonging to such a world is too high, and no one should have to pay it with their life.